300 meters east of El Guettar, in the cold dark before dawn on March 23, 1943, a rifleman of the 18th Infantry presses himself flat into a half-dug slit trench and listens to a sound most of the men around him have never heard up close before. A low, grinding cough of engines, dozens of them, idling somewhere down in the wadi below. Dust hangs in the air even before sunrise, kicked up by tracks that have not yet moved an inch. Somewhere behind him, a runner is already moving up the line, and word is spreading in whispers through the trenches. Panzers, a lot of them, and most of the men passing that word believe, without needing to say it out loud, that somewhere out there in the dark, directing this attack personally, is the most feared armored commander in the German army. They are wrong, and that single mistake, repeated for more than 80 years in books, documentaries, and nearly every popular account of this battle since, is the first thing this story needs to correct. Because the man who built the 10th Panzer Division into a weapon capable of humiliating a green American army 1 month earlier was already gone. 14 days before this dawn, sick, exhausted, and finally out of patience with a campaign he privately believed was already lost, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had boarded an aircraft out of Tunisia for the last time. He would never command troops in Africa again. What was rolling toward that ridge in the gray half-light was not Rommel. It was his doctrine, his hand-picked division, and his own quiet contempt for the American soldier, inherited whole by the general who replaced him. And in the 6 hours that followed, that contempt would be answered by the very men Rommel himself had once privately admitted he feared. Not because they were good soldiers yet, because he suspected they were about to become good soldiers very quickly. To understand what was about to happen in that valley, you have to go back exactly 1 month, to a defeat so total it nearly broke the American army before it had properly begun. In the 3rd week of February, at a mountain gap called Kasserine, Rommel's armor tore through the inexperienced American 2nd Corps almost effortlessly. Command posts were overrun before staff officers finished plotting the map. Entire battalions surrendered where they stood. American losses climbed past 6,000 men, along with nearly 200 tanks, more than 100 half-tracks, and 200 artillery pieces, the worst single defeat the United States Army had suffered against Germany in the entire war. The verdict among German officers was swift, and it was unanimous. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who would inherit Rommel's command within weeks, judged the American soldier physically soft, his officers incompetent, and concluded that sustained pressure would make the whole army come apart at the seams. British commanders reached much the same conclusion and said so bluntly to anyone who would listen, certain that their newer allies needed firm and patient guidance from more seasoned hands. An American war correspondent named Ernie Pyle heard those whispers too, and pushed back in print. "There is nothing wrong with the common American soldier," he wrote. What Pyle understood, and what von Arnim did not, was that the deeper an American unit got into a fight, the more dangerous it tended to become. Eisenhower did not wait to find out who was right. Within days, the officer blamed for the disaster was relieved of command, and in his place came George S. Patton, a cavalryman with polished boots, an unforgiving eye for discipline, and a reputation for demanding results. Patton fined officers for appearing in public without a helmet or a necktie. He tightened supply routes down to the individual truck. He made it plain, in the bluntest terms available to him, that the era of amateur soldiering in Tunisia was finished. 40 miles south of Kasserine, in the sunburned hills around a dusty oasis town called El Guettar, that claim was about to be tested by the finest armored division Germany had left in Africa. Before we go any further into that valley, if you are the kind of person who wants the real story behind the battles that Hollywood never got around to filming, this channel exists for exactly that reason. Consider subscribing to Sam, WW2, and join us as we keep digging through the war the movies left out. Now, back to El Guettar. Command of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red one of the oldest and proudest formations in the United States Army, belonged to Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen, a man who trained soldiers less like a schoolmaster and more like a street fighter. Allen had little use for parade ground polish. He believed in aggression, initiative, and a willingness to bleed for ground that actually mattered, and his men, for the most part, worshipped him for it. When a staff officer once suggested he pull back under pressure, Allen's answer left no room for a second opinion. He would shoot the first man who tried it. By the 3rd week of March, Allen's division had already taken the towns of Gafsa and El Guettar with barely a fight, Italian garrisons melting away ahead of Colonel William Darby's Rangers, who scaled a sheer cliff face by hand in the dark to take an Italian outpost from behind, capturing 200 prisoners without losing the element of surprise. What lay directly ahead of the division now was harder. East of El Guettar, a narrow valley pinched between two ridgelines, Djebel Berda to the south and Keddab Ridge to the north, formed the only practical corridor for armor moving toward the coastal town of Gabes. Whoever held that gap controlled the road east, and whoever controlled that road threatened to cut off every German unit still facing Montgomery's advancing British Eighth Army. Allen read the ground the way a hunter reads a blind. He placed the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 18th Infantry Regiment high on the shoulders of Djebel Berda, dug in and overlooking the valley floor. Along Keddab Ridge to the north, he stacked the rest of his infantry, the 26th Regiment, more of the 18th, elements of the 16th, into overlapping fields of fire that left almost no approach uncovered. In the valley floor itself, under cover of darkness, engineers buried thousands of anti-tank mines in belts the Germans could not see and had no particular reason yet to expect. Staff Sergeant Shima, watching the eastern approach through the last hour of darkness, was among the first to spot movement in the pass and pass the alarm up the line before the sun had cleared the ridge. Attached to the division for the first time in real strength was the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, built around a new and largely unproven doctrine known simply as seek, strike, and destroy, trading armor for speed and concealment because their vehicles carried a gun but almost no protection at all. On paper, it was a gamble. In the valley below, at 6 o'clock that morning, the gamble was about to be tested by 50 tanks. The 10th Panzer Division came out of the eastern pass in the gray half-light exactly as German doctrine demanded. Tanks first in a broad wedge, half-tracks and motorcycle infantry fanned out behind them, self-propelled guns trailing to add weight to the punch. 6,000 men, 50 operational panzers, a veteran division that had smashed through France in 1940 and ground its way through the worst fighting on the Eastern Front since. Its commander expected exactly what Kasserine had taught every German officer in Tunisia to expect: American lines that folded on first contact. For a few minutes it looked like he was right. The leading tanks rolled over forward outposts before full daylight, scattering a thin screen of infantry who had not finished digging in. Radios crackled with confusion up and down the American line. Then the column reached the minefield. The first tank to strike a mine did not explode in the way the movies would later suggest. It simply stopped, one track flung loose in the dirt, its crew already scrambling to bail out under fire. Behind it, the column slowed to route around the obstacle, and in slowing, it tightened into exactly the kind of dense, hesitant cluster that artillery officers dream about. Every battery within range had been waiting for that moment. American 105mm howitzers, 155mm guns, and the 601st's thin-skinned tank destroyers opened up almost simultaneously, walking high explosive rounds across the stalled column, while anti-tank fire picked the tanks off one at a time from concealed positions along the ridge. One panzer commander, taken prisoner within the hour after his tank was disabled at close range, would later tell his interrogators that he had never experienced artillery fire so fast, so accurate, and so relentless in 3 years of war, including Russia. A young panzer grenadier captured beside him put it even more plainly. "Nobody warned us about the mines," he said. "We drove into a trap that had been waiting for us for days." Panzer crews who had survived Poland, France, and the worst months on the Eastern Front found themselves boxed into a killing ground with nowhere to maneuver and nothing resembling cover to reach. By 9 o'clock that morning, 30 of the 10th Panzer's 50 tanks lay burning or abandoned across the valley floor, and the survivors reversed course and fled back through the same pass they had come from less than 3 hours earlier. What was left behind told its own story. Smoke stood in thin black columns over the wreckage, bending sideways in the morning wind. Ammunition inside the dead tanks continued to cook off in short, flat cracks for another hour, long after the fighting had moved elsewhere. American medics moved out across the valley floor, picking their way carefully between mine markers, treating German wounded alongside their own, while a slow column of prisoners, hands laced behind their heads, was walked back toward the rear under guard. General Fritz von Broich, commanding the 10th Panzer from a forward post east of the pass, received the casualty figures within the hour and reportedly went quiet for a long moment before ordering the survivors to regroup rather than press the attack a second time that morning, a decision that would have been unthinkable for this division 1 month earlier. One young panzer crewman, writing home 2 days later in a letter recovered after his capture, put the shock in plainer terms than any staff report managed. "We were told this would be like Poland again," he wrote. "It was not like Poland. The Germans were not finished for the day. A second thrust came that afternoon, aimed squarely at the high ground of Djebel Berda, where the 1st Battalion of the 18th Infantry sat directly in its path. From a forward observation post on Hill 336, 3 men watched the engagement unfold below them. Major General Allen, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., and General Patton himself, who had driven down from Corps headquarters to see his newly disciplined army prove itself or fail in the open, in full view of its own commander. What they watched was not so much a battle as a demonstration. German infantry, pushed forward in support of what remained of the panzer thrust, advanced across open ground directly into artillery that had already been registered days in advance. Time-fused shells burst above their heads in bursts of black smoke, and the effect, according to the men who watched it, was less like combat and more like a controlled execution. Soldiers folding where they stood because there was no cover left to reach. One battalion broke and tried to reach a dry wash to the rear. According to Brigadier General Clift Andrus, the division's chief of artillery, not one man of that battalion made it. Patton, watching in silence beside Roosevelt, finally spoke. "It seems a crime," he said quietly, "to murder good infantry like that." It was, in its own strange way, the most honest tribute the American army paid its enemy that entire day. A grudging recognition, even in the middle of slaughter, that the men dying in that valley were not cowards. They were simply outfought, on ground the Americans had chosen and prepared days in advance. By weapons the Americans had positioned long before the first tank ever crossed the ridgeline. On Djebel Berda itself, the fighting had turned close and personal. Lieutenant Colonel Robert York, commanding the 1st Battalion of the 18th Infantry, held the northeastern shoulder of the mountain against German infantry probing for any gap in the American line. Isolated for stretches of the battle, low on water under a desert sun and under fire from 3 directions at points during the fighting, York's battalion refused every opportunity to fall back to easier ground. For hours at a time, runners could not reach his command post, and York had no way of knowing whether the units on either flank still held or had already been overrun. Only the sound of gunfire that never quite stopped and never quite told him what he needed to know. He made his decisions anyway, on instinct and on the ground in front of him, because waiting for certainty was a luxury the mountain did not offer. The position held through the worst of it. It would not be the last time York's name appeared in a report for stubborn, exposed defense, a pattern that followed him through the rest of the war and, years later, into a general's stars. Down in the valley, the price paid by the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion had been steep. Of the 31 half-tracks that went into action that morning, 21 were destroyed, and 14 men of the battalion were killed defending artillery positions with vehicles that offered their crews almost no protection at all. A 50 caliber machine gun and a 75mm cannon bolted to an open, unshielded platform, built on the theory that speed and surprise could substitute for armor plate. It was a brutal doctrine to fight under, and the men of the 601st paid the difference between theory and reality in blood, yard by yard, gun by gun. But they held their ground against tanks that outweighed and outgunned them in every measurable way, and by nightfall the German advance through Guettar had been stopped twice in a single day. A German officer of the Afrika Korps liaison staff, writing a report to his superiors in the days that followed, admitted that the Americans had adapted to combined arms warfare with a speed that surprised every officer who had fought them at Kasserine. Another prisoner, an infantry sergeant taken during the fighting on Keddab Ridge, told his captors something closer to a confession than a complaint. After Kasserine, he said, "Our officers promised us the Americans would break the moment real pressure came. Instead, it was our infantry that broke, and the Americans who did not move. What makes Guettar worth remembering is not simply that the Americans won. It is why they won, and what that victory quietly undid." Rommel's armored doctrine, concentrated tanks, speed, shock, and a willingness to exploit the first crack in an enemy line had shattered the American army at Kasserine 1 month earlier, because that army had been strung out, poorly coordinated, and led by a commander who rarely left his own headquarters to see the ground for himself. At Guettar, none of those conditions applied anymore. Patton had rebuilt discipline from the ground up. Allen had studied the terrain personally and built a defense in depth specifically designed to punish an armored thrust. Minefields to slow it, artillery to break it apart once it slowed, tank destroyers to finish what the guns started, and infantry dug into high ground on both flanks to prevent the kind of envelopment that had doomed American units at Kasserine. Consider what that doctrine had already accomplished elsewhere. In Poland, in 1939, concentrated armor and speed had broken a determined defense in weeks. In France, in 1940, the very same principles, applied by some of the very same officers, had shattered a larger and better equipped army in a matter of days. At Kasserine, 1 month before Guettar, that doctrine had done it again, this time to Americans. 3 times, the formula had worked, because the enemy on the other side of it had been unprepared, poorly positioned, or simply outclassed in coordination. Guettar was the first time an American commander had studied that formula closely enough to build a defense specifically engineered to defeat it, mine belt by mine belt, gun position by gun position, and it was, in effect, the very doctrine the Germans themselves had perfected in France in 1940. turned back against them on ground of the Americans' own choosing. Von Arnhem's spoiling attack assumed an enemy that would panic under pressure, because that enemy had panicked exactly 1 month earlier, under a different commander, in a different position, defended by men who had not yet learned the lessons Kasserine was about to teach the entire American army all at once. The 10th Panzer Division that rolled into El Guettar was, if anything, a stronger and more experienced force than the one that had broken through at Kasserine. It did not matter. The Americans it met that morning were no longer the same army it remembered. By the time the fighting around El Guettar finally quieted in the first days of April, American forces had linked up with the advancing British 8th Army, closing a pincer that Rommel had feared for weeks and could no longer influence from a hospital bed in Germany. The 10th Panzer Division lost roughly 37 tanks across the full 3-week campaign. The Big Red One's own losses approached 1,300 men, a brutal price for a battle most Americans today have never heard of. Stanhope Mason, the division's operations officer, later called El Guettar the most severe battle of the division's 3 years of war, a striking claim from a man whose division would go on to storm the beaches of Sicily, land on Omaha Beach on D-Day, and grind its way through the hedgerows of Normandy. Major General Manton Eddy, who commanded the 9th Division alongside the Big Red One in the later stages of the fighting, reached the same conclusion entirely on his own. Decades later, one veteran of the Africa Corps, interviewed for a regimental history long after the war had ended, admitted that El Guettar, not the fall of Tunis a month afterward, was the moment he personally stopped believing the war in Africa could still be won. It was the day, he said, that he understood the Americans were no longer the army his officers had described to him after Kasserine. And yet El Guettar rarely appears in the popular memory of the war. Kasserine is remembered because it was a humiliation, and humiliations tend to make better legends than corrections do. Normandy is remembered because cameras were there to film it. El Guettar sits quietly in between, a battle where the American army proved, in the span of a single brutal day, that everything the German officer corps believed about it after Kasserine was already out of date. No film has ever been made about the tank destroyer crews of the 601st who died defending artillery positions in unarmored half-tracks. No monument marks Robert York's stand on Djebel Berda the way Omaha Beach is marked today. The battle simply became a bridge to bigger, more photographed battles, remembered mainly, when it is remembered at all, as the fight where Rommel finally lost to the Americans. Except Rommel was never there. He was in a hospital bed in Germany, recovering from an illness that would keep him out of Africa for good, reading after-action reports of a battle fought entirely without him, against a plan built on his own outdated judgment of soldiers he had once dismissed as amateurs. What broke against the minefields and the artillery of El Guettar was not Erwin Rommel. It was his shadow, his doctrine, his hand-picked division, and his own quiet private warning about how quickly the Americans might learn, proven true in the one place he was not present to see it happen. The men in that valley on the morning of March 23rd were never fighting the Desert Fox. They were fighting his legend, and by the time the sun went down over El Guettar, on ground of their own choosing, the Big Red One had already started taking that legend apart, one tank, one ridge, and one stubborn American position at a time. Somewhere on that ridge, the rifleman from Pennsylvania who had listened to the engines in the dark that morning was still there when the sun went down. Filthy, exhausted, and, for the first time since Kasserine, no longer wondering whether the man across the valley was unbeatable. He had never seen Rommel. None of them had. What he had seen instead was a German division, built and trained by the best armored commander of the war, break against a plan drawn up by men who had learned, in a single brutal month, exactly how to beat it. That was the story El Guettar actually told. It simply took the rest of the war for anyone to notice.